Welcome back to the Paranormal State, Washington, and UFO UAP. With Makāula Nakae, a lifelong experiencer and ET contactee since 1990. Today's episode, 1952, Project Y, Avro Canada. The journey of building a terrestrial flying saucer officially began in 1952 when brilliant British aerospace designer John Carver Meadows Frost, affectionately known as Jack Frost to his colleagues, walked into the workshops of Avro Canada and Malton, Ontario, with a radical idea: to truly grasp how a tabletop experiment with compressed air in a Canadian workshop transformed into one of the most enduring legends of Cold War aerospace and UFO lore, we have to look closely at the brilliant, eccentric mind behind it all, British aeronautical designer John Carver Meadows Jack Frost. In the turbulent geopolitical landscape of the early 1950s, aerospace engineering was hurtling into uncharted territory. Jet engines were pushing aircraft past the sound barrier, but this supersonic leap came with a catastrophic vulnerability: traditional, miles-long concrete runways. Military strategists realized with mounting panic that a surprise Soviet first strike could pulverize Allied airfields overnight, leaving the West's entire fighter fleet trapped and helpless on the ground. The holy grail of 1950s aviation was vertical takeoff and landing, VTOL. While most engineers were trying to solve this by building clunky, awkward tilt rotors or pointing heavy jet engines straight down, Jack Frost looked at the sky and saw something entirely different. In 1951 and early 1952, working inside the advanced design facilities of Avro Canada in Malton, Ontario, Frost began experimenting with compressed airstreams, annular nozzles, and miniature circular wing models. His breakthrough concept relied on a radical reimagining of lift and thrust. Instead of a traditional linear layout, Frost designed a massive, flat, centrally located turborotor engine that drew air in from the top and bottom. The engine's extreme exhaust was designed to be forced outward in a continuous 360-degree radial sheet across the curved upper and lower surfaces of a disc-shaped hull. By exploiting the Quanda effect, where a fluid or gas stream clings to a curved surface, the craft could generate an immense uniform cushion of high-velocity air, creating massive vertical lift without traditional wings. Convinced he had cracked the code to frictionless, omnidirectional flight, Frost pitched the concept to Avro Canada's executive board. Recognizing both its revolutionary potential and its terrifying engineering risks, the company officially greenlit the classified research in 1952 under the now legendary moniker, Project Y. To look at Jack Frost's initial 1952 designs for Avro Canada's Project Y is to step inside a mind that viewed the laws of mid-century aerodynamics as mere suggestions. Frost wasn't interested in building a slightly better biplane or tinkering with a conventional jet fighter. He was designing an entirely new class of aerial warfare, a machine that existed on paper as a terrifyingly sleek, lens-shaped dart disguised as a flying disc. Here is the deep dive into the radical architecture and the staggering performance targets that defined Frost's initial vision for the ultimate Cold War point defense interceptor. In the early 1950s, aerospace designers were running hard against the limits of the human body. When jet aircraft began pulling extreme G-forces during high-speed turns, sitting upright in a traditional cockpit meant pilots risked blacking out as blood rushed away from the brain. Frost solved this physiological bottleneck with radical geometry. The aircraft was designed as a lens-shaped lenticular, disc, or shovel blade profile, minimizing aerodynamic drag across a 360-degree radius. To handle the brutal G-forces expected from supersonic vertical maneuvers, the single pilot wouldn't sit upright. Instead, they were positioned flat on their stomach, prone, inside a central cockpit bubble, or embedded flush within the upper hull. This allowed the pilot to endure immense vertical and horizontal acceleration without losing consciousness, effectively matching the structural agility of the machine. Unlike a conventional plane that required banking and turning via ailerons and a tail rudder, Project Y relied on radial vectoring control. By shifting internal louvers and modulating the massive sheet of exhaust blowing out of the circular rim, the pilot could theoretically vector, thrust in any direction instantly, sliding sideways, stopping dead in midair, or pivoting on a dime. If you pull the engineering estimates and mathematical models drafted by Frost's team in 1952, the projected capabilities sound less like mid-century aviation and more like hard science fiction. The craft was engineered to lift off vertically using pure downward thrust from its central turborotor. It needed no tarmac, no catapults, and no long runways. It could be hidden under camouflage netting in a dense European pine forest, scramble vertically at a moment's notice, and vanish into the cloud cover. Once airborne and clear of the vertical lift phase, the pilot would tilt the craft's thrust vector, shifting the radial air sheet to push the disc horizontally. The mathematical models predicted a seamless, frictionless transition from a hovering helicopter-like platform into a high-speed interceptor, capable of breaking the sound barrier. Ross's theoretical calculations claimed that the smooth laminar airflow over the lenticular body would allow the craft to punch through the sound barrier with minimal drag, reaching sustained speeds between Mach 1.5 and Mach 2. On paper, Project Y was the ultimate defensive weapon, a nimble, runway-independent supersonic saucer that could outmaneuver any Soviet bomber or fighter in the sky. The tragic irony, of course, is that paper is infinitely more forgiving than physics. When these grand designs were later scaled down, heavily modified, and physically built into the awkward tether-bound Avro, reality delivered a brutal reality check. The complex aerodynamics of radial jet flow proved nearly impossible to stabilize, capping the physical prototype speed at a disappointing 35 miles per hour and keeping it trapped barely 3 feet off the ground. Yet those 1952 blueprints remain a monument to a fascinating era, a time when military necessity and human imagination collided so violently that the US and Canadian governments seriously tried to build actual flying saucers in secret hangars. To the Canadian military and early defense analysts, it promised the ultimate defensive edge. A fighter jet that needed 0 runways, could hide beneath tree canopies, and could scramble instantly to intercept incoming Soviet bombers. The financial reality, when vision outruns the bank account. As is so often the case in aerospace history, the chasm between visionary blueprints and hard physical engineering proved brutally wide. By late 1952 and into 1953, Project Y began crashing headfirst into severe physical hurdles. Building a central engine powerful enough to lift a heavily armed metal disc, while maintaining structural integrity, pushed 1950s metallurgy and turbine design to absolute breaking points. Avro Canada was a thriving enterprise, but the astronomical research and development costs required to solve the complex aerodynamics of radial jet flow quickly ballooned far beyond the private resources of any single contractor. The project was bleeding cash, and it needed a superpower's checkbook to survive. Sensing that Project Y held immense strategic value, or terrified that the technology might leak or be abandoned, the United States military stepped in. Through the early U.S. Air Force and Mutual Weapons Development Team channels, American defense officials evaluated Frost's designs. Recognizing the potential for a breakthrough VDOL weapon system, the U.S. government took over financial and administrative control of the research. The initiative was stripped of its modest Canadian title and reclassified under heavily guarded, black-budget U.S. designations. Project Silver Bug and related design studies like WS-606A and Project 1794. Deep underground facilities and specialized U.S. contractor teams were brought in to assist, shifting the focus toward building a tangible flying prototype. The transition from Jack Frost's 1952 tabletop experiments at Avro Canada to the U.S. black budget vaults of Project Silver Bug marked a critical turning point in Cold War military history. It proved that governments were willing to fund the absolute fringes of aerodynamic science in the desperate quest for dominance. Though these early efforts would ultimately culminate in the famously ill-fated Avro, a craft that struggled to rise more than a few feet off the ground, the foundational dreams of Project Y forever blurred the line between terrestrial engineering and the burgeoning mythology of the modern UFO era. What started in a Canadian laboratory in 1952 as an engineer's eccentric tabletop experiment, with a stream of compressed air, quickly transformed into one of the most famous classified aerospace adventures of the mid-century, to be continued. Watch and listen. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full podcast now. Explore the archive Cosmic Awakening Volume 1, 1991, Peru, Journey into the Unknown. Sacred Valley of the Incas. Volume 2, Ascension 2012, The Golden Alchemy. Part 3, The First Contact and the Paranormal State. Join the journey. New episodes drop periodically. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 10 to 30-minute exploration into the evolution of ufology, perfect for your daily plunge into decoding hidden messages from outer space, designed to raise awareness and foster human evolution. Subscribe to support your inner development. Thumbs up to help push our channel through the algorithm. Comment below. If you were an engineer in 1952, would you have believed a circular disc could fly, or would you have laughed Frost out of the room?